Count first. If y'all raise your hand for your daily Bible read, we'll let Mike get a count. Sorry, Barry. I thought you needed a little extra time on the plastic there. All right, now, if you'll raise your hand, if you need a quarterly, Barry's got those if anybody's in need of a book for this morning. And if you've got your quarterly, if you're getting your quarterly, we're going to be taking our lesson from page 51, lesson 5, the death of Sisera this morning. I'll let Mike get a count, and when he's done, Eric, do you mind leading us in a word of prayer before we start this morning? Amen. Justin wanted me to announce, because he meant to announce this in the announcements this morning, but it being the fifth Sunday, of course, as we complete up here for Bible study, we're going to have a meal in the annex, and obviously we want everybody to stay for that. We'll have our fifth Sunday young men leading the service at 12:30, and Alan's going to be leading the lesson in that today. And then following that, we usually meet at the pavilion for service, usually 2 o'clock or a little before. So if there's anybody we can get to come down there, he wanted to make sure he announced that, since we didn't get that in the announcements this morning. But again, if you will, grab your quarterlies and turn to page 51, or if you want to turn with me in your Bibles, part of the scripture that will be taking place this morning for the lesson is going to be out of Judges chapter 4, and then a little piece out of Judges chapter 5. The death of Sisera. We're going to get into this just in a little bit, but continuing on this study of Judges, I think it was Dusty a couple weeks ago that had kind of mentioned the overall theme of Judges, unfortunately, is one of those of kind of an unfortunate cycle of the Israelites and how they've kind of forgotten things that God has blessed them with. They've kind of reached periods of blessings, and then as time goes on, they kind of forget God and they kind of become complacent. Things kind of take a turn, and we've got some rulers that are unsavory, and once they reach these areas of turmoil, they start calling back to God, and then God provides them. Since this period of history for the Israelites, we don't really have any kings. This is called the period of the Judges, where we just have these certain leaders or judges that take place and kind of lead the Israelites during this time of turmoil. And so we have these periods where we have these judges that kind of lead them out of these periods of turmoil to kind of get things set back again. And then, unfortunately, the process starts all over again, and we have the Israelites that kind of, when things are good, they become complacent again, and so on and so on. It kind of keeps taking place. And I wanted to draw a comparison this morning. I got to thinking about this over the last couple of weeks. So just a couple of months ago, we were studying out of the book of Joshua for our adult Bible study services. And, of course, what we learned from Joshua, we had the patriarchs of the Old Testament, of the Israelites. We had Abraham, as Justin mentioned in his sermon this morning. We had Jacob, and we had Moses that led the Israelites out of bondage and out of slavery, out of Egypt, and brought them towards the promised land. After the death of Moses, we had Joshua that kind of stepped up to fill the role of Moses. Joshua did so kind of reluctantly. He didn't necessarily want to be the leader, but he took on the task. And God had promised the Israelite people the land of Canaan, and all the 12 tribes would have their own designated land, and Joshua helped them through that. He led his people during that, and of course, as we studied and we emphasized many times, it was God that brought them through these battles. There were tough battles where the odds were definitely against them. Going even back to when Moses was leading them, and we learn about Joshua and Caleb and how the 12 spies and how 10 of the spies thought that the people were too big. Well, God led them through all these instances where they felt like the odds were against them, or like the numbers were too big, or the armies were too strong, or they had something against them that would make the Israelites seem to be small in comparison to them. But God led them through all these. But the point I'm trying to make in the illustration I'm going to say this morning is that there were obviously a lot of battles fought. It did take, even though God led them through it, there were still families and tribes of Israel that literally fought with their hands and fought with weapons and tools. And then afterwards, when they settled in the land of Canaan and they all had their designated areas and lived in peace for a number of years, things were really good. And then, as the book of Judges tells us, apparently that the generations that followed didn't necessarily keep in mind the battles that were fought by the forefathers that came before them. And I kind of get to thinking, I think back to probably 2000, 2001. I was a student at Jackson County High School, and I had a teacher named Mr. Tommy Brown. I figure there's a couple in here this morning. I don't know if Johnny ever had Tommy. Peggy, I figured, might have had Tommy Brown in school, but you kind of had to know his personality and his teaching style. He was a good teacher. He had a unique style. But this happened more than once. I was sitting in his U.S. government class, and he would kind of get into a discussion about the youth, or my generation, I guess, and he would say to himself, and he had it in this tone. I'm going to try to mimic him, but he'd say, what we need, I know what we need. We need a good war. We need to reinstate the draft. We need some of you boys to go to war. I'm going to push pause there for a second because I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. At that point in time, when I was 15 and 16 years old, there was nothing that scared me more than going to war, than reinstating the draft. I'm not saying that to illustrate this story. That was truly, I would say, prayers at night that God would keep peace so that there'd be no wars, that I wouldn't have to be drafted to go to war, because I appreciated all the things that happened before the time before me at that point, because World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, those were all horrible, horrible wars where lots of young men went and died, and that scared the daylights out of me. September 11th happened, and my biggest fear was that I hated the fact that somebody had done an act of terrorism that major to United States civilians and citizens, that my first thought is, we're going to have to go to war, and here I'll be 18 in 2 years, I'll be primed for that. But anyway, going back, he would say that, and I understood what he meant. I understood what he meant. What he was trying to say is that probably men of my age at that time probably had a certain air about us, or we had an attitude, or maybe we didn't seem grateful or thankful, or maybe we just didn't appreciate all the things. And an 18-year-old in the year 2001, 2002 had no respect or responsibility that an 18-year-old back in 1942 or 43 might have had. And he was right in a lot of ways. I just didn't like the way that he had said it. But he was right. What he meant is that maybe there was a lot of us, or there was a lot of people in general, that had taken for granted a lot of things, because there had been periods where things were good, things were prosperous, and maybe we had forgotten the things that were being fought for years before us. And I draw that comparison because that may have a little something to do with the generations that followed after Joshua's time. Of course, Joshua dies. In the first chapter 2 of Judges, we learn that Joshua dies. And unlike when Moses, we were told that Moses had died before entering into the land of Canaan, there wasn't really a designated person to step up and fill his place. So the period of Judges, we just basically kind of run through it, and there's these significant leaders that kind of step up at the time when the Israelites are in their gravest time of need, and they kind of pull them through it, and they do great things to get them there. And so Chris had kind of set up the lesson for today last week by introducing us to Deborah and introducing us to Barak, and we're going to continue the introduction of them through this lesson today. We do remember, and I've made a list of a couple of people we need to remember. Of course, Deborah was pointed out to us that she was a judge of Israel during this time. She was also a prophetess, and as we were told in last week's lesson and earlier in Judges chapter 4, that Deborah approached Barak and said that we need your help to defeat Jabin. Jabin was the king of Canaan during this time, and basically, since God's people seemed to forget him, God allowed the Canaanites to come back over and start trying to take them over. So there was a period where Jabin was kind of overtaking all the Israelites and the things that they had worked for, and they were in a time of serious need. And so Deborah, I mean, what's interesting to us is that there are lots of significant females in the Old Testament, but up until this point, this is still pretty early on in the history of the Israelites and how they came to prosper and how the kingdom of Israel and stuff came to be. We're still not there just yet, but we're still in the building phase, and it's pretty early that Deborah is actually a major judge during this time. And from everything that I've studied, we don't necessarily need to think of the judges that we're talking about here like a judge in a civil or a criminal court. The judges are, from everything that I can gather, they were similar to like a political leader, a political chief or something like that maybe made decisions for the area or something like that. I don't know specifically if she was passing judgment on people, but chapter 4 tells us that Deborah was a prophetess and judging Israel at the time, and verse 5 tells us she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim, and the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. So that tells us, I mean, the tree of Deborah, so it must have been a pretty common spot where she would go to, where everybody knew that they could find her. And they would come for whatever areas of judgment that they needed to work out. And we'll go back because she went to Barak and said to him, if in verse 8 of chapter 4, she said to Barak, if you will go with me, or no, I'm sorry, let's go back a couple of verses. She basically had told Barak that she needed him and his troops to go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. And Barak was a little reluctant, but he basically said to Deborah, if you go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. So that kind of tells me that Barak was reluctant. Obviously, if he trusted that Deborah was a prophetess, as she claimed to be, he could take her word, but maybe he must have thought that I'll take this as serious if you'll go, then I'll know that maybe we truly have God on our side. And we do want to remember as we go into this lesson today that she reminded him that I will surely go with you. There will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So we can only gather at this point that she basically means that because of Deborah, she being a woman, maybe she's the reason. But we're going to learn something a little different. That may not be the case after we look in today's lesson. So continuing on to the second half of chapter 4, I'm going to start. I'm just going to read a few verses and kind of go through this. Judges chapter 4, verse 17 says, however, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael. And I do want to stop there. I'm sorry, I meant to go back. The last few verses that we studied last week's lesson basically said that Deborah did go along with Barak and his 10,000 soldiers. She told them at the direct time to strike. And when they did so, Barak's army was able to defeat all of the soldiers. If I go back to the last few verses of that section of Scripture that we used last week, verse 15 of chapter 4 says, and the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. So going back, Jabin was the king at this time, and Jabin had appointed Sisera to be leader and commander of the army. And what the Scriptures tells us on one or two occasions is that Jabin had something pretty unique for his soldiers. Does anybody remember what it was that was touted once or twice in the book of Judges, that tools of warfare maybe that Jabin's army had? Does anybody remember what that was? There were chariots. There were a certain number of chariots. 900, which I imagine, in any comparison, that's a large number of chariots. But they were also ironclad. So I think that it must make mention of that once or twice to the point that chariots probably were fairly common in warfare at that time. I assume 900 must have meant that there was quite a lot of them. And the fact that they were ironclad must have meant that they were protected pretty heavily. It must have been pretty serious stuff. But how is that unique in the context of this lesson? Does anybody have an idea? Why would it matter that Jabin's army had 900 ironclad chariots? If we go back and compare this to some of the battles during Joshua's time, or maybe even a few of the battles even while Moses was still leading the Israelites, This to me tells them that the odds were against them. The fact that they had 900 chariots that were ironclad obviously made this a pretty tough trek right here. This had to be a pretty tough battle. It doesn't mention that if they had any chariots at all, if Barak's army had that, it doesn't mention it. And obviously, they probably, even if they did have chariots, I don't think that they were ironclad. So it's basically telling us that it was kind of skewed possibly of how one side is versus the other. But again, Deborah mentioned that the Lord is basically taking care of all this. So Barak and his army had to have faith in the Lord. And obviously, that worked out because as it tells us in the last two verses of this passage of Scripture from last week's lesson that Sisera got away. Sisera was the leader of the army, but all the others fell by the edge of the sword. And verse 16 tells us that not a man was left. So this is where we start today. We have had Barak and his 10,000 soldiers that takes on Sisera and Jabin's army, and they defeated every one of them. Somehow Sisera was able to escape on foot, and this is where we start our lesson today. Verse 17 of chapter 4 says, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. We don't know much about the Kenites. The Kenites were mentioned once or twice in Judges. I think they were mentioned elsewhere in the Old Testament. But as far as we know that Moses' father-in-law was a Kenite. They were known to be nomadic people, which meant that they could basically travel here to there, didn't necessarily settle on one home. And the author has kind of given us credit to kind of learn that Heber, I don't know how significant of a Kenite he was, but apparently there was some form of peace. It does tell us that there was peace between Jabin, who is the king, and Heber, the Kenite. So it's obviously pretty significant because after this battle has taken place and Sisera has lost every one of his soldiers, he's able to escape on foot, and he heads straight for the tent of Heber the Kenite. It tells us that Jael is the wife of Heber the Kenite, and Jael was home at the time that Sisera was making his way. Verse 18 says, And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not fear. And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket. Jael was obviously very accommodating to Sisera. Sisera, obviously, as we can tell, had some form of solidarity. I can't think of the right word that I want to use this morning, but Sisera obviously felt that Heber was a trusted ally, even though that we feel like he may not have necessarily been a supporter. He might have been a neutral party at this, but at the very least, he was a nomad that him and his family, or he and his wife lived in a tent just outside the area, and that he obviously felt like he could trust him and his wife enough to go there for cover as he was running away, because Barak, they basically did run down some of these chariots and killed the rest of the men with swords, and they are obviously after Sisera at this point too. But we don't know that Heber the Kenite was there. We only hear of Jael, and she willingly comes to Sisera as he comes through. He's probably tired running on foot. We imagine he may even be injured. I mean, if he was involved in the battle, it could be any number of things. But she gives him a blanket and she welcomes him inside the tent. Verse 19 then says, Then he said to her, Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So what does Jael do? She doesn't give him water. She opens a jug of milk, which to me, I don't know why that's so interesting. That you think back 4,000 or 5,000 years ago when they actually, I don't know how we transcribe the language or the Hebrew language, but they still call it a jug of milk, or somehow it was called to us a jug of milk, which is interesting to me. But she opened up a jug of milk instead of water. She gave him a drink and covered him. To me, as I'm thinking about this, we're going to learn that Jael, obviously, like Deborah, plays a very important role, and they're also women. And that doesn't mean anything other than to say that at this point in the Old Testament, they're playing some pretty big roles as women. And I kind of think to myself, Jael is very unique here, because maybe if she was Heber himself, or if he was a man, I wonder if it would have been, she kind of has some motherly instincts that he's obviously trusting her. He asks for water and she kind of one-ups him and kind of gives him some milk there. She wraps him up with a blanket. 20 goes on to say, verse 20 says, and he said to her, which is Sisera talking to Jael, and says, stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you and says, is there any man here? You shall say no. So Sisera is in a very vulnerable state right now. He's being hunted down for blood. I don't think they intend to take him as prisoner. They've killed every other one of his soldiers by sword. He has thought of somewhere that he could go as a safe place. He's kind of met Jael, and Jael has definitely been hospitable to him. We can only imagine that if he's tired and she's wrapping him up in a blanket and giving him milk, I mean, she's hiding him. He's basically said, if anybody comes to you and asks if there's a man here, tell them no. And Jael is kind enough to kind of go along with everything he's saying. Then we read in verse 21, then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg. Thousands of years back, if any of you have ever set up a tent, weather permitting, if it's fine, it's probably fine to where you don't have to put stakes and kind of keep things down. But even as far back, that's kind of a difficult thing, and you needed something to kind of keep your tent staked into the ground. I imagine that's what they meant by a tent peg. She took a tent peg, and then it says she took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple. That to me just seemed like it was a very gentle lead up, and very swiftly she just nails the temple. And I don't mean to be too violent in this, but there are some pretty violent, vicious stories in the book of Judges. If you're going for the temple, I think we all understand that that's a pretty vulnerable area on the head area, that we want to protect our temple, because if you take a good blow to the temple, that's apparently a soft spot, or it hits a very vital part that we're not able to be protected for, and it can cause death. And I don't think she went to do anything here but to cause him death, as it so appears. Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him. Now, she didn't kind of go, I guess she didn't want to wake him up or didn't want to startle him, since she basically, well, anytime you give somebody milk and give them a blanket for a baby or a child, I mean, that's time for bed. So I imagine she was probably just kind of making sure he was good and comfortable so she could run a tent peg through his temple. And it went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary, so he died. So that is exactly, in one verse, it tells us all that. And then we continue on. As Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said, come, I will show you the man whom you seek. And when he went into her tent, there lay Sisera dead with the peg in his temple. Now, as we go back, Deborah approached Barak and said to gather your soldiers, because we're going to enter you into battle to fight against King Jabin. But the glory will be to the Lord and will be from a woman, basically. I'm paraphrasing. And you might have thought, or we might have thought, and even Barak might have thought, that might have meant that Deborah was going to take credit for setting all this up. But I believe that Deborah was saying that there's someone else at play here, and I think that it was Jael. Jael basically took her role as someone that could, I imagine that she was very sympathetic to the Israelites during this time, the way that Jabin was, probably not doing too well by his people here. I mean, Judges chapter 4 basically starts off, I'm going to go back and it says, when Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. So I don't believe that was necessarily a good thing. We can only imagine all the difficult and the terrible things that an unrighteous ruler would probably put on God's people. And as promised, the victory did belong to the Israelites, and Jael took a big portion of the credit or she was credited for this. Now, okay, the second half of the scripture that we're going to look at today, we're going to take from Judges chapter 5, so one chapter over. And this is actually considered poetry, and I personally don't like poetry. I don't appreciate poetry, I should say that. It's not that poetry is bad. I've just always been somebody that needs the details straightforward in most types of poetry, and specifically there's a style of poetry in the Old Testament, probably some in the New Testament, that's not just for pretty words or kind of putting it in a very graceful way. There's a message. Poetry has a way to deliver a message that's not just straightforward. I'm always the type of person, if I'm reading something or I'm trying to learn something, I just appreciate the straightforward stuff. But sometimes when we get into Judges and 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Samuel and Chronicles, some of these things, the details can get kind of dry because there's lots of rulers, there's lots of judges, and there's lots of things. So sometimes that it can even be monotonous when you're learning about so much of history in a short book. But here we have poetry, and it's beneficial to us because we're actually, instead of getting something like in basically just text form of telling a story or telling the facts as they happen, poetry kind of gives us some emotion. It gives us some symbolism. And I have to admit that I don't appreciate those things because I have to make more of an effort to try to understand and make sure I'm understanding the message that it's given. But if you can understand it, and we're lucky because we actually have some good commentary to help us to break this down. We're going to read verses 28 through 31, and I'm going to read this in its entirety. It's not very many passages, but to kind of give us, it's actually, as doing some research on this, it's actually known as the Song of Deborah. So we're going to read through this real quick, and I'll go through it before we finish up here. Judges 5, verse 28 through 31, starting with 28, says, "The mother of Sisera looked through the window and cried out through the lattice, 'Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarries the clatter of his chariots?' Her wisest ladies answered her, 'Yes,' she answered herself. 'Are they not finding and dividing the spoil, to every man a girl or two, for Sisera, plunder of dyed garments, plunder of garments embroidered and dyed, 2 pieces of dyed embroidery for the neck of the looter? Thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the sun when it comes out in full strength.'" If you're reading that like I just did, it's very easy to just read that and take nothing from that. But what's interesting to me, as Chad or whoever is helping us with the commentary here kind of points out, we need to read this from the point of view of Deborah and Barak. Deborah, obviously, as we're talking about, was the judge at this time, the prophetess that kind of had this vision or had this thought that God will deliver Israelites' people, and she needed Barak's help with his armies, and they're kind of looking at this. And then we talk, the first thing that mentions in the verse 28 is the mother of Sisera. We've talked about Sisera. We've talked about the fact that he was the leader and the commander of Jabin's army. But his mother was never mentioned or anything like that. What does that really have to do with anything? Well, in the context here, they're basically saying the mother of Sisera, they're just basically all of a sudden taking this taking us to a different place, wherever Sisera's mother might be. Apparently, we're kind of understanding that Sisera knows that he's went off to battle, and she's out kind of watching for him to come back. And she's wondering, why is his chariot taking so long to get here? Why can't I hear, if he's got ironclad chariots, why can't I hear the iron kind of scraping on the cladder or scraping on the chariot? I should hear him at least coming down the path at this point. What's taking him so long? It says her wisest ladies answer her. And yes, she answers herself. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil? We've talked about this, or at least I know I have, and mentioned it in some lessons previous. When you're in the course of battle, once battle's done, if you have one side that has overtaken the other, the spoil is basically the things that are left over that the prevailing army could make use of, or the people. They can take of money or riches, they can take of weapons or shields or whatever the case may be. The things that the army that was conquered may have left over, that party can, the victorious party can kind of come in and take all that, and they can just strengthen themselves that much more. But she's wondering out loud to herself, are they not finding and dividing the spoil? Should they not have already done that, and shouldn't he be back by now? They start talking about what we can only assume is taking in women to bondage, or that sort of thing, pillaging, that rape, or however you want to say that apparently was common to, after a battle, taking of women. This doesn't paint Sisera in a very pleasant light. We're not really made to believe that Sisera is a very wholesome person as it is anyway. This is only telling us that much more. And what's more, if this is coming from his mother, she understands how horrible of a person he probably is, and how horrible the soldiers probably are, if this is the sort of stuff that they're talking about. For Sisera, plunder of dyed garments, plunder of garments embroidered and dyed, 2 pieces of dyed embroidery for the neck of the looter. These are all things that are kind of painting Sisera as probably the typical leader of an army at that point in time, but which is not really a good thing. And we have to remember that this is Deborah and Barak kind of telling this story. They're the ones that are telling, like, picture Sisera's mother looking out the window wondering where he is. She knows what he probably should have been doing or what he had been doing, and he's not back yet. And then they kind of come back and they say, thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord. This is them talking directly now. Let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the sun when it comes out in full strength. And we can only, again, poetry can be used to illustrate things, maybe not necessarily literally, but maybe figuratively. And we can think of the sun as something bright. This morning we've had a beautiful Sunday morning, kind of cold. But the sun is out shining bright, and we always look to that, and the sun actually acts as a piece of symbolism that we use quite a bit, a bright, shining sun. And she's basically saying, Lord, let all your enemies perish, and let those who love you be like the sun that comes out when it comes out in full strength, bright, shining, and strong. This is a great day for the Israelites. They have defeated Jabin and his army. They had been living under a certain period where things were not so great. Apparently because they had taken God for granted. They had forgotten the things that he had provided them. They had forgotten the battles that Joshua had led the Israelites through, and they had forgotten the fact that God was the one who let them win these battles. And Deborah reminded them that God can bring bad things upon them for forgetting them. So we can look at this lesson, and unfortunately there's a few more in the book of Judges that they're going to have their periods of down, and they're going to have their periods of up, and this is a period of up. But unfortunately, as we're going to continue on through our lessons, there's a cycle that's still going to be at play here. It's also a good reminder to us. Chris brought this up last week in his lesson and said that when things are good, he mentioned the example, and it's a great example. I mentioned September 11th just a few minutes ago, but when you think about that time, Chris brought the illustration that during that time, after that happened, we as a people were brought together, and we were as one, and we were supporting one another, but also there were a lot of people that had remembered in a time of turmoil that they were turned into God. There were lots that had already been, that knew God was there, but there were some who had kind of maybe forgotten or maybe turned their back that kind of remembered that we need God to take us through all this. And unfortunately, this is a lesson that the Israelites are kind of being reminded of here. And so it's a good lesson to us to take from it that complacency is a pretty powerful thing and a very negative thing. And we as Christians can take that as a lesson and always try to remember that God's always there for us. I appreciate your attention. Thank you for being here.